Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be taking you through my entire freehand sketching process for this graphite still life study that I worked on in one of my sketchbooks this week. A question I often get asked by beginners getting started on their art journeys or drawing journeys is how I arrive at effective proportions, locations of different elements within space, effective shapes, and all that kind of stuff when drawing completely freehand. And so today I thought I'd take you through my entire process and give you the main strategies and the main things that I make sure to have in mind that enable me to arrive at an effective preliminary sketch that I can then move on to painting or shading in, or whatever it is that I would like to move on to. Because having an effective preliminary sketch really is the basis and the foundation for everything else. And I've mentioned this in a past video. If the proportions, the perspective, the shapes, or anything else is off in that preliminary outline sketch, then no amount of shading, detail, or color work is going to help us fix that faulty foundation. That would be like trying to paint the walls of a house when it hasn't been properly constructed, or like trying to decorate a cake when it hasn't been properly baked. I'm going to be bringing in the 4-quadrant method, which is something that I used a lot in the beginning, especially as I was starting to develop my visual measuring skills. I'm going to bring in the envelope method, which is something that I've talked about before in my other freehand sketching videos. Why it's so important to work from general, larger shapes and make your way towards specifics. Things I take into account when adding details, and finally, I'm going to briefly talk about what I would do if I were going to take that preliminary sketch further and take this into a value study, how I would create or describe highlights, midtones, and darks, using only a couple of different drawing pencil grades, and my own little mix of alternative shading and mark making techniques. All right, you guys, without much further ado, let's go ahead and jump straight in. So this is the reference photo that I chose for this study. I downloaded this one from unsplash.com, and it was taken by photographer Gareth Paul. I'm going to be leaving a link where you can download this photo down below for you in the description box. I chose this reference photo because it's very visually pleasing, it's balanced, it has a good variety of forms and structures in it. It has something that is man-made, more symmetrical, more perfect, more geometric-y, and it's combined with more organic, irregular objects, the onions on the right. And also the fabric under the onions presents very interesting folds and shadows and highlights throughout it. The angle and the perspective that this photo was taken from also creates very interesting slanted lines created by the edges of the table that the objects are on. This photo also has a great balance between lights and darks. It has a nice light situation going on. I can easily tell that the light source is hitting these objects from somewhere above them and to the right of them, because the cast shadows, which you can easily see on the table, are opposite to the light source, below the objects and to the left. And I can easily tell where the lightest light areas are, I can tell a wide range of midtones, and I can tell where the darkest dark areas are, and all of that is going to come into play when I work on developing my values in the second part of this drawing process. And the reason why I wanted to make sure to bring all of this in is because I often see beginners work from very poor reference photos that make the process way harder than what it could be. They choose photos that are very small, blurry, pixelated, cropped in weird ways, or simply are underexposed or overexposed or taken with flash, which make it very difficult to see your different values. And all of these things are going to make the drawing process harder. Obviously, if you can't see the different values, if the photo is very flattened out because it's very dark or very light, and you can't see all of those different highlights, midtones, and darks, then how are you going to make them happen in your drawing or your painting? So take time to look for a great reference photo. Another tip that I want to make sure to provide, especially for those of you just getting started on your drawing or sketching journeys, is make sure that you are starting with simple objects, and if possible, I always recommend my students get started with still life. Start with still life arrangements that have 1, 2, 3 objects in them, and then make your way towards more complex still life compositions, and then everything that you develop with this practice All of the skills that you're going to be learning from the strategies and the tips that I'm going to be providing next are things that you can bring in when drawing pretty much any subject, whether it's an animal, a portrait, a landscape, or anything else. Make the learning process and your acquisition of skills easy for you and take things incrementally a step at a time so that you don't make the learning journey more overwhelming and frustrating than it needs to be. All right, you guys, so let's go ahead and jump in. For this quick sketch, all I'm going to be using are 2 different drawing pencil grades. I'm going to get started with an HB, and later on I'm going to be switching to a softer pencil grade, which is a 2B. If you have no idea what different drawing pencil grades are and how they can come in handy throughout the drawing process, I would highly recommend checking out my drawing mini course for the total beginner. I'll be leaving a link to that free mini course down below in the description box of this video. Aside from those 2 different drawing pencil grades, I also have my soft graphite eraser on hand and my kneaded eraser in case I need to go in and do some lifting up of excess graphite that might be floating around on my paper, or I want to go in and lighten my sketch. Of course, my sketchbook, and that is it. I first want to share about the 4-quadrant method, which is something that helped me tremendously in the beginning as I was developing my observational skills and my visual measuring skills. And all this entails is simply breaking up your reference photo into 4 equal parts. So 4 squares or 4 rectangles, depending on the format of the photo. You're just going to place 1 straight vertical that is going to separate your image into equal left and right halves, and 1 straight horizontal that is going to divide your photo into equal top and bottom halves. And then once you have those 2 lines in your reference photo, you're just going to go ahead and recreate those same 4 quadrants on your sketchbook or whatever page you're going to be drawing on. Now, I've done this a lot of times. So right here, what you're seeing me do is just create that rectangle, that drawing area that I'm going to be working in, completely freehand. You can certainly help yourself with a ruler when you're creating this drawing space that you're going to be working in, and also to lay down your vertical and your horizontal. Now, if you're asking yourself, well, how did you know how wide and how tall to make that rectangle? I am doing this intuitively because, again, I've done this many, many times, taking into account the proportions of the overall photo that I am seeing. I'm trying to recreate that width of the photo and the height of that photo, or the proportions of the photo, to the best of my abilities, of course, at scale, so that that rectangle fits in my sketchbook page. But the proportions of the image itself is what I am thinking of as I am creating that rectangle. However, for total beginners out there, I would recommend, and this is also something that I recommend to my students, is just use a reference photo that is exactly the same size as your drawing area, so that you can just know and rest assured that the image that you're looking at is exactly the same proportions as your drawing area. So how do you do this? Open up your image in Photoshop or GIMP, which is a photo editing software which you can download for free online. Then simply change the size of your reference photo. So if your sketchbook is an 8x10 sketchbook or a 9x12 sketchbook or whatever it is, turn that image into exactly the size that you need so that you can rest assured knowing that the image that you're looking at has exactly the same size and proportions as your sketchbook page or whatever rectangle or square it is that you draw in your sketchbook page. I hope that that makes sense. This is important because let's just say that you draw a rectangle freehand in your sketchbook that is going to be your drawing area, and it is way longer or way shorter than the image that you're looking at. That could really throw you off when it comes to you measuring things out and placing things in their correct location within that drawing space. With the 4-quadrant method, you're really using the middle vertical and the middle horizontal as guidelines for yourself, but also you're using the edges of your rectangle or your square, whatever it is that you just drew, to really compare distances, alignments, angles, widths, heights, locations of all of these different elements that you start adding inside. And if those proportions are way off for your drawing area, that could really affect your visual measuring process. And of course, by product of that, your proportions are going to be off. In time and with practice, you're no longer going to be needing a ruler. You're going to be able to lay down these lines more intuitively the way that I did. And later on, you can even do without the 4 quadrants altogether. And you can just make use of straight lines, whether they are verticals or horizontals, that can help you decipher alignments, angles, distances between elements, etc. throughout the drawing process as needed. All right, moving on to the next thing, and this is going to be to start laying down what I like referring to as envelopes. I've talked about envelopes before. It's a technique I use a lot to the day, even when I am not making use of the 4 quadrant method. I always started drawing out with envelopes. And all envelopes are just big, blocky general shapes, a blocky silhouette of my elements, so to speak. So I am tuning out all of the smaller details, all of the smaller shapes, and my intention with these envelopes is simply to start from general, make my way towards specifics, and start placing my elements, especially the most important elements, in space in their appropriate location and also in their appropriate size. I am tuning out everything that doesn't matter right now. I am focusing on only that. And later on, I'll be refining curves and even making things a little bit wider, a little bit taller, moving things slightly to one side or the other side. Right now, my objective is to just start laying down blocky, large shapes in space so that I can have something to work with. It's not until we start laying down elements in space that we have more points of comparison and we can start refining along the way. As I am laying down these straighter lines to create those blockier shapes, I am giving thought to the major angles that I'm able to see in the photo, to how things align. I am comparing widths of different elements to each other, heights of different elements to each other, and really visualizing or pinpointing major landmarks present in the image. It can be very helpful when you're getting started to actually print your image and draw these lines or even little crosses in major landmarks over your photo. These major landmarks, as well as the major angles created, are what I am visualizing and bringing to mind as I am creating all of these envelopes. Visualize these landmarks or mark them for yourself in some way, and then start practicing your visual measuring skills. How much distance is there between that landmark and the top edge of your drawing space, or the left or right edge of your drawing space, or that landmark and the bottom edge of your drawing space, or your landmark to the vertical line in the middle of your drawing space, or to the horizontal line in the middle of your drawing space, whatever makes sense. And if it's helpful for you, you can also divide each quadrant into halves, into thirds, into fourths visually to decipher locations, proportions, alignments, etc. It's pretty understandable how having a straight vertical right in the middle of our drawing space and also a horizontal right in the middle of our drawing space is very helpful for us in deciphering all of these things. We're more easily able to tell if our placement of different elements within space is effective because with these lines in our image, we can see whether a large portion of our different elements falls within one quadrant or another quadrant, how close they are to the middle vertical or to the middle horizontal. We can also see the shape created by the negative area around our different elements, which can definitely help us decipher how much space to leave between our different elements and also between the edges of the different elements and the edges of the actual drawing space. And our brains, they simply tend to understand straight verticals and straight horizontal lines a lot more easily than irregular angles and irregular lines and shapes and that kind of thing. So having those lines there, both the lines in the edges of the image and also the lines in the middle of the image, they provide these guidelines for us that we can compare everything to or with. And the more elements we start adding in, the more points of comparison we are going to have to continue comparing things with. Always remember that getting proportions right is all about getting the relationships between the different parts making up the whole image right. So it's not about one single thing or one single element in the image, it's about how everything fits together as a whole. So we have to get used to and train ourselves to continue comparing all of these different elements that we're placing in space with each other on and on and on in terms of height, width, angles created, distances between each, locations within space, on and on and on, and continue refining along the way. At least I would say that half of your drawing time should be spent looking at your reference photo, and continue training yourself to constantly look at your reference photo. The more you practice, the smaller your mistakes become. But always remember that drawing is a refinement process. You're not really meant to get everything down on paper perfectly right off the bat. And this is why I always mention in my drawing and sketching tips and tutorials videos that it is super important to draw lightly so that you can easily erase mistakes along the way, and so that those initial lines that you lay down are not super visible. You want to be able to erase them along the way and continue refining your drawing as you pinpoint little things that need to be corrected. You can even find old master sketches online, and you can make out those faint lines that they got started with in the beginning of their drawing process. And then once they got in the proportions, the locations, the perspectives, everything right, they then went in with darker lines, marks. They then went in and developed shading or whatever it is that they would be jumping off to. All right, so I finished up with my major, largest general shapes. And once I was happy with everything, it was time to move on to the medium-sized shapes. So as you can see, I'm still tuning out the smaller parts of the design in the picture, and also tuning out the details in the onions. And I am just now starting to draw the fabric under the onions. I know that drawing fabric folds can be overwhelming and frustrating, so just simplify things for yourself and just acknowledge major shapes and lines first and go from there. Don't start worrying about the little nooks and crannies and little loops and things like that until the major shapes and even lines have been drawn in. It's all about continuing to simplify things for yourself and tune out the things that don't matter in the beginning. Once the main major shapes and lines have been laid down, it's a lot easier to go in and add in the smaller details. Once I'm done here, it is going to be about time to start erasing out my middle vertical and my middle horizontal. So that's what you're seeing me do right here. I'm just erasing it out with my soft graphite eraser very carefully, completing these lines that I erased out just now, and then it's gonna be finally time to move on to the smallest shapes and details. I'm also going to be adding in those slanted lines behind these elements that are going to represent the edges of the table. And this is the point in time, once everything has been set in place, that I start thinking about smaller shapes, smaller details in the design of the picture, smaller shapes and lines created by the fabric folds. Another way to see it is dividing your space into larger shapes, then medium shapes, then smallest shapes. And something I want you to notice is how I haven't really even started adding in those little, I guess they're roots coming out of the top of those onions or whatever they are. I haven't even thought of adding those individual little lines, if you want to see them in that way. I haven't even started to think about adding those in. Even for those, I just at this point visualize the overall shape that they are creating as a group. And this is because I don't see that kind of detail as being a shape. I see them as being lines. And anything that you might see as being a line, I really wouldn't add it in until the very end of your process when all of your shapes have been added in. For example, when you're drawing something like a portrait and you're gonna be adding in eyelashes, really what's best is adding in the eyelashes until the very, very end, after you have developed all of your shapes, all of your values and your color work that you're going to be doing, and then you think about adding in the eyelashes. It wouldn't make sense to add in the eyelashes before everything else has been set in place. And if you're going to be developing color and values, then that should also be already developed before thinking of starting to add in any quote unquote line type of detail. However, personally, I try to stay away from calling even those types of details lines, because a lot of beginners, when they hear the word line, they think of a consistent thickness from start to finish when it comes to those lines. And really, when you're trying to make something look realistic, you want to think of a line weight variation even in those little details that we might initially see as being lines. We want to always have certain sections of those quote unquote lines being thicker and other sections of those quote unquote lines being thinner. You want a line weight variation throughout them, because if you go in and create any sort of line that has a consistent line weight or thickness from start to finish, or you create any obvious stark looking outlines around really any of your elements, that is going to take away from the realism of your piece. That is going to lead to flatness. You're going to be creating very distracting marks and lines. And especially when you're going for mid to higher levels of realism, that's not really what we're going for, because in real life, there are no outlines. With mid to higher levels of realism, we want to keep things relatively subtle and make sure that any contrast that we're creating because it's something that we're actually seeing in that reference photo or whatever is present in front of us in real life, not because we're just adding an outline from imagination because that's what our brain is telling us to do, because that's what we're trained to do since a very young age, to add outlines around everything, to color inside the lines. That's what we've seen in cartoons and coloring book pages, etc. And we're trying to train our brains to see shapes, see different value shapes, not see different elements being separated by an outline around them, because that's not what happens in real life. In real life, we see edges, not outlines. We see those edges where different values meet, where a light value meets a dark value, and sometimes those edges are lost because the value outside of the element and inside of the element are very, very similar. This is one of the reasons why developing your observational skills as an artist to be able to tell all of these subtleties in whatever you're looking at is very, very important, so that you can make it happen in your drawing or painting. All this said, of course, what we're working on right now is a preliminary outline sketch, right? We're focusing on shapes, we're focusing on developing effective proportions, perspectives, etc., because this is going to be the foundation and the base for anything else that we decide to move on to next. So right now, yes, these are outlines. I guess you could see them as outlines. But this is why I'm also making sure to use my pencil very lightly, because at the end, especially whenever I'm going for realistic shading techniques, or I'm going to be moving on to painting this with watercolor or whatever it is, I don't want to be able to see these outlines at the end of the process, because I know that that would retract from the realism that I'm trying to create. Now, if you've gotten through to this point and you've been able to develop believable proportions, perspectives, shapes, and all of that, that is already amazing for a beginner to be able to do, especially when you're drawing freehand. So this I would consider an extra. I am a huge believer in going into every single study with a specific objective or goal in mind. And for this study, this was exactly the objective. The objective was to create a preliminary sketch that showed effective proportions, shapes, perspectives, and everything. Because again, for the third time, that is the foundation for everything else. And if you're not able to get that in right freehand, then it wouldn't make sense to move on to anything else. So if you're just getting started with drawing, focus on that first. Focus on creating a preliminary outline sketch that shows all of those things. And then once you're comfortable with that, then you can move on to shading, because as I said, no amount of shading or detail or texture or anything is going to fix a faulty foundation. But if you are going to be moving on to developing a value study or any sort of shading or painting on that preliminary outline sketch, then this is what I would be moving on to next. All right, so what I am doing right now, after having laid down my largest shapes, then my medium shapes, then my smallest shapes, is I am starting to map out my different value areas that I'm able to perceive in that reference photo. All the word value means in art is the lightness to darkness of different colors present. Value really is number one when it comes to developing a sense of realism and depth in a drawing or painting. So it's very important that you develop your skills to be able to tell where different value areas are located, notice where highlight areas are, where midtones are, and where darkest dark areas are. I would recommend simplifying the process for yourself, especially because this is intended to be a quicker sketch, and our main objective with this piece has been checked, has been completed, right? We have arrived at effective proportions, shapes, perspectives, and all that. And this is like an extra. So I would recommend breaking up the different values into just highlights, midtones, and darks. Just simplify the process and notice those three key areas present in the reference photo. Lightest areas, midtone areas, and darkest dark areas. And then simply create shapes for yourself. Lay down shapes slightly inside of all of your different elements, and also in areas of cast shadow on the table, especially where you're able to see the highlight areas and the darkest dark areas. Create those abstract, irregular shapes for yourself, taking into account the shapes that you're able to see in that reference photo, but don't feel that you have to go in and lay down those shapes super precisely, because they can be slightly off in terms of shape, in terms of size, and even a little bit off in terms of location. And if you just try to make them happen to the best of your abilities, and of course your skills will improve the more you do this, but even if they are slightly off, you're likely still going to arrive at a good sense of realism and depth and 3D-ness. But do try to get those values in as best as you can. Make sure that you're acknowledging all of these different value areas in your reference photo and that you're trying to replicate them to the best of your abilities in your sketch. So once I had mapped out those most important highlight areas and darkest dark areas, it was time to start shading things in. And for this one, because I am doing a quicker value study, I'm not doing any sort of smooth shading technique with a blending stump or anything like that. I am using alternative shading and mark making techniques. And this is my own personal little combo that I really enjoy using for this type of value study that enables me to develop different values in a relatively quick manner. And I personally really enjoy a sketchier, unfinished look. So this is the combo that I use. Initially, I still go in with the same pencil gray that I was using before for my preliminary outline sketch. So this is still my HB pencil. And what I am doing is I am going in with hatching. All hatching is laying down straight parallel lines in a same angle or direction. Whatever angle or direction it is that you choose, just commit to that angle, at least for one specific grouping of lines, and keep them as straight and parallel as possible. I have entire videos and tips on pen and ink and alternative shading and mark making techniques in which I explain about the main alternative shading techniques, which I'm gonna make sure to link to down below in the text section of this post in case you'd like to learn more about specific techniques and exercises that I would recommend to improve your alternative shading and mark making techniques. And these are techniques that you can use with pen and ink, or you can use with pencil like I am doing today, or really any other sort of drawing medium. But anyway, so I go in with hatching to start, with my same drawing pencil grade, and what I am doing is I am focusing on laying down a layer of lines to essentially cover everything except for my highlight or lightest light areas. So I am covering up areas of midtones and I'm covering up areas of darkest darks. For this study, I'm going to be focusing primarily on the most important elements here, so the picture, the onions, the fabric, and also, of course, the cast shadow is important to transmit a sense of realism because it really situates the objects in place and makes them look like they are actually on a surface as opposed to floating in the air or something like that. But in terms of the values created on the table itself and also in the background, I'm gonna leave those to a minimum. All right, so I'm almost done here with my first layer of marks all throughout my most important elements and also the cast shadow. So you can see how I left areas of lightest lights free of any lines. And I have covered up all of the midtones and the darkest darks with that first layer of lines. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna switch on over to my slightly softer pencil grade, so my 2B pencil. You can see right away that this is a softer pencil grade because of how dark those lines look when compared to the previous lines that I was laying down. And I'm using the exact same amount of pressure here. I'm not even exerting any pressure at all. And what I am doing now is I am overlapping or creating a second group of hatch lines on top of that previous group of hatch lines, but I'm focusing on areas of darkest midtones and darkest darks that I'm able to see in that reference photo, allowing all of the highlight areas just to be left free of any graphite. And also I'm not adding any more graphite on areas of lighter midtones that I'm really not looking to darken anymore. I am focusing on darkest dark areas now and only doing this overlapping in those sections of darkest values that I'm looking to push more. As I am doing all of this, I'm really acknowledging all of these dark value shapes as abstract, irregular shapes, especially when you're developing those darker values, for example, in complex patterns or designs, like the bottom of this picture here that has a lot of smaller curved sections. Your brain might tell you to go in and create a dark value all around the outer edge of these shapes, but that's not really what's happening in that reference photo. That is going to end up looking quite cartoony because you're going to end up creating an outline effect. And as I said before, we're not going for outlines. So really acknowledge the dark value shapes that these little curved structures create on each other. And you're going to notice that the light situation or the values throughout these very small little curved structures, they change. The light source is hitting these little curved structures from different angles and perspectives because they are wrapping around that major structure of the picture. And you're going to notice that the values change from one to another because of the light situation that is going on and how the light is hitting them from different angles and perspectives as they wrap around the larger structure of the picture. It's important to acknowledge the location of the light source in regards to the major structure that these smaller curves are sitting on. First and foremost, it's important that you acknowledge the picture itself. Tune out these smaller little curved sections. Think about how that major structure is being affected by the light, and then those structures are secondary on top of that major structure. I like seeing my drawing or sketching process as sculpting on the page. So if you think of yourself as a sculptor starts with a big block of marble or clay or whatever it is, right? It's a blob or a block of material. And then they start giving that its major structure, the major planes are getting created. And then once the major planes are created and that major form has been created, they then take that down and start developing the minor planes. It's the same thing that I am doing, only I am drawing. The major structure is always number one, and those smaller little design elements are secondary. So always look for ways to work from general and make your way down towards specifics, and really trust that by making those different value shapes happen that you're seeing in that reference photo or whatever it is that you have in front of you in real life, if you try to make those happen to the best of your abilities in your drawing is really going to start looking like what you want it to look like. But there is no need to go in and draw out the edges of every single little curved section or anything like that, because by just simply making some of those value shapes happen, you're going to be able to describe that design. Notice how even at this point, with a very minimal amount of value work developed in these areas, I'm already able to communicate this type of design. It's not necessary to overly describe anything. And it's pretty crazy how much you're able to describe by just making a few different values happen and trusting in what you're seeing in that reference photo. All right, you guys, so we are officially in what I would see as the very last leg of this sketching process. So I'm pretty happy with the values that I've developed all throughout this sketch. I have my highlights, I have my midtones, and I have started developing my darkest dark areas. And with this part of the process, I'm looking to do a few things. To begin, what you're seeing me work on right now is I am defining some of the edges, especially in the elements closest to us as the viewer of this scene, where I want to just create a little bit more definition and contrast. Aside from that, I'm also going to be adding in those line little details, for example, like the roots on top of the onions. It's time to start adding that in. And finally, I'm also going to be pushing some very darkest dark areas using a little bit of scribbling. I really like bringing in scribbling at the very end of my sketching process because it's a quick way to really push darkest dark areas because I'm able to cover up a little section with more graphite very quickly. At this point of the process, I'm really allowing myself to be looser, to be more expressive, to bring in imperfection. I'm jumping around the entire piece from area to area and keeping things loose, keeping things moving. Notice right here how I am only pushing some very small irregular shapes throughout these little curved sections along the bottom of the picture here. And also notice how I am staying away from the look of obvious heavy looking outlines as I am defining those edges by bringing in a lot of line weight variation into my lines and my mark making. In many cases, those lines are not even connecting, and there is almost always at least somewhat of a tapered look to my lines, in which a section of the line is thicker and another section of the line is thinner. And by keeping it moving and laying down those lines more quickly, I am able to arrive at more of this tapered look, at a line weight variation in the lines that I am laying down, so that I can stay away from the look of heavy outlines and flattening outlines. I am still using my 2B pencil. I kept things super simple for this sketch and only used 2 different pencil grades. At this point in the process, I do allow myself to press down a little bit harder, but I am still never pressing down so hard that I start scratching or damaging my paper. At no point in time do I press down too hard. I also mostly define the edges in the elements closest to us as the viewers of this scene so that I could create more of an illusion of depth and have the elements farthest away from us just a little bit less defined. All right, so once I was happy with all of that, it was time to start going in with a heavier application of graphite only in very darkest dark areas. So I am now doing my scribbling, and I'm also going in some cases and covering up little shapes with graphite by going in and actually doing back and forth motions with the side of the tip of my pencil to allow me to cover up an entire shape as opposed to using lines. And this is because, of course, the more paper you cover up with graphite, the darker the value. The less paper you cover up with graphite, the more paper is left shining through between your lines, the lighter the value, of course. So now, because I am pushing darkest value areas, I'm trying to just cover up a larger amount of paper in very darkest value sections. And this is me going by my artistic license and using my artistic eye to decide whether I want to push darker value sections with lines or marks, or I want to go in and actually cover up an entire little shape with graphite. Ultimately, what matters here is developing light values, midtones, and darkest darks. And if we don't push darker value sections, then we run the risk of not developing a wide enough variety of values to actually be able to create somewhat of a sensation of 3D-ness and depth. All right, so just to finish up, I switched on back to my HB pencil here. In some cases where I felt I needed to develop some more lighter values or lighter transitions between darker values and lighter values, I went in with this harder pencil grade and just did a little bit more value development with it. And then also with this pencil grade, I started adding in that faint illusion of lines or the texture in the onion's skin, because I didn't want to draw those lines with my softer pencil grade and have those lines be too stark looking and too distracting. And finally, all that is left is I'm continuing to compare my sketch to the reference photo, and I am noticing if there are any darker value sections or transitions that I need to continue working on to add the 3D-ness and the depth that I am looking for in this sketch. And I go back and forth between whatever drawing pencil grades I have selected for the process on hand, depending on what it is that I am working on. If I am working on lighter value areas or lighter transitions, then I make sure to use my harder pencil grade. Or if I'm going to be adding in subtle details, I make sure that I use my harder pencil grade as well. And if I am looking to push darker value sections or add a little bit more contrast, then perhaps I use my softer pencil grade. Make sure that you switch between your drawing pencil grades intentionally and mindfully. And also that the pressure that you're exerting on your paper goes hand in hand with the value that you're trying to develop. Of course, without ever pressing down too hard, because it's very easy to start scratching and damaging your paper, and you definitely do not want to do that. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye, guys.